Thank you. Okay, my name's Holly Goyert. I'm the director of the Net Positive Initiative at Biodiversity Research Institute. I'd like to thank the co-organizers of this symposium, Kate Williams, Wayne Goodale, Evan Adams at BRI, as well as Kim Peters at Ørsted, Scott Johnston, and Caleb Spiegel at the Fish and Wildlife Service. I'd also like to thank the Nature Conservancy and NYSERDA for helping coordinate this symposium. And you'll see Kim and Caleb will be coming up here and helping me with the Q&A at the end of the session. So this symposium complements our previous symposium where we heard about how offshore wind energy developers may choose to support voluntary conservation measures to meet their internal net positive biodiversity goals. But in this case, we'll touch a bit more on voluntary conservation as well as on compensatory mitigation, and we will focus on birds. So what is compensatory mitigation? I'm not going to read this to you. You can read it yourselves, but I will say that the Fish and Wildlife Service defined compensatory mitigation in their 2023 policy under the Endangered Species Act. And what it means is that offshore wind energy projects are now required to offset estimated take of birds, at least for those listed under the ESA via compensatory mitigation. So this was a sea change. It occurred last year, as recently as last year, and in part it was due to the development of collision risk modeling efforts, which we heard about on Wednesday. And those have been used by the service to estimate impacts of offshore wind energy on birds. Now, at least 8 projects are cumulatively required to offset the take of approximately 2,000 red knots, shown here on the bottom left, 100 piping plovers, shown in the middle, and about 5 roseate terns on the right. So I coordinate the Atlantic Marine Bird Cooperative Working Group for Marine Spatial Planning. It's a multi-sector partnership of approximately 140 technical subject matter experts from about 32 organizations and agencies that have been actively involved in recent discussions related to today's symposium. And last year, 7 co-authors drafted a collaborative letter to BOEM and the service, which we submitted last summer. It requested guidance on avian compensatory mitigation and voluntary conservation measures to achieve net gain for marine birds from offshore wind. And we heard back from both agencies. The Fish and Wildlife Service mentioned that they were planning to hold a stakeholder workshop. And as many of you know, on Monday, BOEM and the service held an all-day side meeting to discuss the development of a wildlife mitigation framework for offshore wind. So we thank the agencies for holding that meeting. It was very informative, and we're really looking forward to hearing about the progress and further developments on a future BOEM avian mitigation guidance document. So now our core group from that effort with the AMBC has been active co-authoring a perspectives paper providing a bit more detail on what topics we might want to consider in developing such a framework. So just briefly, one of the topics to address is how to achieve no net loss to listed species when we have uncertainty around estimated impacts to birds. And that's also uncertainty surrounding the efficacy of mitigation efforts. So this figure we saw earlier in the previous symposium, it illustrates the mitigation hierarchy. So how we have to first avoid, then minimize impacts to birds prior to compensating for any residual impact. Compensatory mitigation is supposed to get us to the horizontal black line, or no net loss of birds. But you could think of this kind of like The Price is Right, the game show, right? Where if we're trying to guess the price of impacts and the cost of mitigating them, we may very well underestimate the goal of achieving no net loss to birds. So after avoiding and minimizing effects to birds, our compensation for residual impact may end up below the black line rather than on the black line. And one solution to handling this uncertainty is to take a net gain approach. So incentivize to aim above the black line to buffer against unforeseen circumstances. And although the ESA compensatory mitigation policy of 2023 is now limited to a goal of no net loss to listed species, net gain goals were included in the previous version of the ESA compensatory mitigation policy of 2016. So this symposium aims to identify existing research efforts that integrate impact assessment with compensatory mitigation and voluntary offsets. The objective is to provide examples of methodologies and potential metrics that may be used to estimate no net loss and net gain. And then following presentations, we'll have a 15-minute Q&A to answer audience questions. We'll then hold a facilitated discussion with a panel selected from both this symposium and the previous one on the state of the policy. And that's where we'll discuss basically the state of the science on compensatory mitigation and biodiversity positive approaches in the marine environment. So please submit any questions starting now via the app that are specific to birds, and then we'll address more general questions on the policy in the following panel discussion starting at noon. So next up, I'd like to introduce Scott Johnston. And he'll be presenting about Fish and Wildlife Service approaches to compensatory mitigation.
Do I just hit the down button?
Yeah, you can do right or left or down. There we go.
Okay, great.
Thanks. And if you want a pointer, there is one.
I think I'm okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Great. Thanks very much, Holly. Appreciate it. And definitely thanks again to NYSERDA and BRI for organizing the panel. And the one previous, I think, was great to be able to get into the level of detail about net conservation benefit or net positive. I want to capture a few things that were talked about on Monday if folks were attending that was really more focused on compensatory mitigation. But before I start on that, some of my colleagues have told me that I can be rather opinionated about the differences between net benefit and compensatory mitigation, so I'm going to try to dial it back a little bit today. But actually, I'm going to quote one of my colleagues, Caleb Spiegel, who a couple of days ago said, well, Scott, maybe you should think about it like as concentric circles, where there is kind of a little bit of like maybe, sort of overlap or relationship. And in fact, Anthony in the previous, panel, I thought did a really good job where they can be related, I guess. But where I'm coming from, and I think what I want to try to point out as gently as I can, apparently, is that there are some sort of really key issues around specifically, regulated compensatory mitigation that is required. So just a few things that kind of, I think, sort of differ a little bit from net benefit. Oh, am I? Oh, I don't think this is the start. If I remember right, yeah. Yeah, sorry. This is great. You guys are going to, now I can just fly through. Everything. Okay, there we are. There we go. Okay. That was a great way to start. That was kind of cool. Here, in fact, Holly just mentioned these policies, but the reason I wanted to show this slide is not so much to kind of go back in history and what are the different levels and all that, but to really point out is that the Fish and Wildlife Service has been doing mitigation for a really long time, like especially in the West Coast. It's been really advanced there for sure. And so, but as Holly mentioned, and this is what I really wanted to touch on briefly here today, is we do have these two policies that just came out recently, is the one on overall mitigation and then on compensatory mitigation. So, as Holly just said, we just revised that mitigation policy. There's lots of reasons for why it just came out last year, but I'll leave it there. But it was basically the overall mitigation policy then was addressing, resources for which the service has authorities and how and when we recommend mitigation, updated the framework for mitigation, and especially the hierarchy as well that we've been speaking about. So a couple of things that I think are really important about this mitigation policy, and again, these are kind of, some of these terms I think are important to kind of emphasize because of the role that they play within compensatory mitigation, and again, maybe which is a little bit different than net positive. And so, and again, it reaffirmed the principles of the overall mitigation policy, reaffirmed that mitigation hierarchy, right? Avoid, minimize, and then mitigate. And also, I think the fourth bullet down there, the landscape approach, I think is really, really important for some of the compensatory mitigation that we're dealing with now. With Holly's, I keep referring to Holly. It's almost like you gave the presentation for me. But with the red knot, especially if you guys were around on Monday, that's going to be a real tough one, to mitigate, right? And we're very likely going to have to look outside of the U.S. And that's not been done in mitigation, at least within the Fish and Wildlife Service. And then terms like durability, which means like how long is the project, that mitigation, going to be operating, I think is a really, really important part of of conducting mitigation, and is definitely one of those definitions that we have to pay really close attention to. And then also that nexus and proportionality, like ensuring that we're doing things in the appropriate way. And now, just jumping over then to so that was reviewing basically the overall mitigation policy, and now I'm going to talk specifically about the compensatory mitigation policy, hopefully within a couple of minutes before Julia gets me off the stage. But it is the first policy under that overall service-wide policy, which is great. And again, it's really a comprehensive treatment of compensatory mitigation for listed species, which I think is important to talk about. And it does provide the direction in planning and implementation of compensatory mitigation for species and obviously for habitat as well. And then I think another important topic, which I think we have to look into with some of these projects for offshore wind compensatory mitigation, is what's called advanced mitigation. And so I think we need to explore what those possibilities might be. And then obviously setting the standards for what mitigation programs and projects must meet. And so again, if you kind of what I just mentioned a minute ago is some of these specific features around compensatory mitigation, I think is really important to think about, is citing additionality. So ensuring that what we're doing for compensatory mitigation is not sort of, it's not on a project that's already being implemented. It has to be basically like a new project. So like a new set of, new species that are produced or mortality reduced. And there are metrics. Again, we're going to have to really measure the credits, the credits, like how many birds are actually being put back out into the environment. And again, there's durability again that we talked about. And then of course it really does have to be about collaboration and transparency. So I really am hoping that like after Monday's workshop and other meetings that we've been having, that we can have a more open discussion with a variety of partners to figure out what to do. And then some of the general considerations there I think are important. Preferences obviously for advanced and strategic future habitat conditions. Eligible lands too. I think there is some misunderstanding about where mitigation can occur. It can occur in a lot of different areas, including federal land, but again, it has to be additional to what's already going on those lands. And then things like, terms like service areas, crediting and debiting, that's where entities like conservation banks, which we talked a little bit about on Monday. Well, there was a conservation banker who presented, and then also an in lieu fee program, conservation fund presented. So there are these tools that we can actually manage mitigation as well. But also what we're very likely facing with the offshore wind environment is what's called permittee responsible mitigation. So that's where the developer is more or less solely responsible for carrying out the project. And how we're going to manage that, I think, is still to be determined. And of course, managing risk and uncertainty, I think, is obviously a really big deal. So my last slide here is that the mitigation policy, as I mentioned earlier, we've been doing compensatory mitigation for a long time. So there's been a lot of lessons learned. In addition to the implementation of, or the ability to do habitat conservation plans over a larger area and then mitigate for those actions. So I think that's really helped us understand how to do compensatory mitigation overall. And then we have been responsive to public input about this. And then also just one quick note, which I'll admit that I borrowed these slides from somebody else. That may be obvious. But anyways, I actually didn't realize this until I was reviewing these slides like 5 minutes ago. And it's consistent with the Clean Water Act 2008 mitigation rule. So I think that makes it a lot easier for people who have done clean water mitigation to now realize that it's very similar to the processes for Fish and Wildlife Service mitigation. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Next up, we have Aspen Ellis from UC Santa Cruz, and hopefully I'll actually get you started, on the beginning of the slides this time. Let's see, I lost my bottom, I can't see.
All right. Hey, everyone. I'm Aspen Ellis. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And there my work focuses a lot on compensatory mitigation and offsetting for seabirds in response to offshore wind energy development. And I'm here to talk about some of my thesis work today on the subject, much of which is collaborating with many people in this room. But I also want to point out that I'm speaking as an academic here, so none of what I'm saying is actually founded in current policy. It's more just trying to produce thoughts as a seabird biologist on how we might be able to set this up in a way that could be effective for the species that need that conservation. How am I advancing these? I think I'm not in presenter view. Weird. Something weird happened. Let's see. Something weird is going on. No, you're good. I don't know what is happening. So many pages. Yeah. All right, let's just. Sorry, guys. Let's see if we can just.
It wasn't me.
There's something. Yeah, this is still open. Good, now we're out of Scott's. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Here we go. All right. Success. Okay, cool. All right, thanks everyone. Great. So to frame us here, we've heard a lot throughout this meeting about how to handle compensatory mitigation under the ESA for listed species. We also want to think about the fact that beyond ESA listed species, seabirds are already a really highly threatened taxa, with about 30% listed on the IUCN Red List, over 50% of seabirds declining, with current populations reduced up to 70%. We've got a lot of conservation that we can do in this space. And they face an array of anthropogenic threats that could potentially act as actions that could be mitigated to boost these populations, such as fisheries bycatch throughout their non-breeding and foraging ranges, invasive species predation of adults and chicks at breeding colonies, and a good amount of habitat loss, especially due to sea level rise, for example, in the face of warming climates. And that means that there is a lot of potential here to mitigate, and also that these seabirds, beyond ESA listed, we really need to be thinking about how we can boost those populations and what it would look like to go beyond ESA listed compensatory mitigation and towards a more general offsetting approach, either at a voluntary or regulated level, in order to effectively plan for these large groups of seabirds that have high conservation needs. And when we're thinking about where we actually want to target that mitigation, I think it's important to consider that there are a number of different components of vulnerability that we want to be thinking about in order to consider which of those species beyond the ESA listed ones currently might need to be focuses for that mitigation action. And you can think about their spatial overlap with those development areas as exposure, their behavior and morphology that may make them more or less sensitive to displacement or collision, and then having that overlay with that population status and demography that makes them more or less vulnerable to those impacts. And there's plenty of effective conservation actions that we can use for seabirds, like I was talking about, such as translocation of breeding colonies to more biosecure habitats in the face of sea level rise, for example, eradications of invasive species or biosecurity measures to actually protect breeding colonies or nesting areas, bycatch reduction via alterations to fisheries gear or behavior in order to boost adult populations at sea and reduce adult mortality. And there's plenty more that you can do to be creative here, and we've heard some great ideas, especially in that session on Monday, about things, especially, for example, at migratory stopover sites for non-pelagic species. And you can be pretty creative about those approaches for many species, though, of course, there will remain some for which mitigation is quite challenging, and we'll need to think about that as well, especially when it's the case of those highly vulnerable populations. But we do have challenges with offsetting planning. Especially as you're starting to move beyond these reasonably refined lists of ESA-listed species. You can think about, especially as we're thinking about the Pacific, for example, where I do a lot of my work, you've got a lot of pelagic seabird species that are hugely broad-ranging with really constrained breeding colonies, which tend to be where huge proportions of their populations are concentrated. And therefore, dealing with threats at that non-breeding scale or that breeding scale may be very different and may be highly localized, for example. And that means that decision-making and policy challenges will come up as we're trying to figure out how we can adequately respond to those impacts, especially when you're thinking about the impact from offshore wind, in many cases, being generated really far from where the mitigation might be best targeted in these species cases. And in order to do that effectively, a lot of what I'm thinking about is sort of the different levels that you need to answer questions in order to figure out how to do that offsetting planning well. The first being how you can basically figure out the debit, so how you can assess what you need to be replacing and how much it would cost to replace that loss. And then from there, once you have generated that funding, thinking about where that money needs to be spent effectively to boost seabird populations, so which species need that compensatory mitigation or offsetting funding, and then from there, how to pick projects that actually will be the most effective use of that funding for those species. So you can think about the different levels that you might be wanting to prioritize that, for example, return on investment versus the capacity of that species to act as an umbrella for other species that are threatened, for example. And I want to talk a little bit more about this piece today. With the recognition that these are just ideas that may help inform like different tools that we can use to assess that impact and how we can then use that to potentially produce funding in an effective scale and then pool that funding throughout a region potentially to be able to do strategic compensatory mitigation planning and offsetting planning at the scale necessary to handle these broad scale regional impacts for highly migratory species. And throughout this meeting, we've heard plenty about the different modeling approaches that can be used to identify impact. So you can think about using data that we collect through seabird surveys, for example, distribution data, combined with characteristics that we understand about those facilities to fuel these models that we've been talking about all week, such as collision risk models, displacement models, and then use those combined models for the species that you're concerned about to assess what the residual impact will be after you've made all of your decisions about where those sites are and the characteristics of those sites. And there's going to be data limitations at all of these steps, especially when you're moving beyond ESA-listed species and trying to go towards more cryptic or poorly understood species. But you can start with those high-priority species and potentially build out as more and more data becomes available and more facilities go online throughout a region. And then there's a number of different ways that you could actually think about costs to replace that impact. Here you can think about once you've calculated that residual impact, be it for a species or a group of species throughout a region or for a particular facility, you then want to think about what it might actually look like to figure out how much it would cost to replace that impact. And there's a number of different tools you can use here, such as a resource equivalency analysis that we've been talking about in the case of compensatory mitigation, where you're figuring out using this modeling process of collision risk and displacement models, roughly how many birds you've lost, using some kind of factor to figure out how many birds you need to make to replace those lost birds, and then how much it would cost to do a mitigation action that would produce those birds and how many birds would be produced by that mitigation action, broadly to think about how much it would cost to replace that loss. And you, again, run into a huge number of data limitations, potentially for some of these species, but when you're thinking about starting with high priority species and building out from there, this may be an approach that you could use to start thinking about how much money might be appropriate to fund in order to boost those populations. And then a large part of why we're talking about doing this for non-listed species is trying to think about, again, moving beyond an individual project by project level scale and trying to think about strategic regional offsetting in order to really fund these large scale population level actions for the species that need it. And you can think about how each of these different wind energy facilities would be putting some amount of that money to replace their residual impacts into a regional pool that could then be used by some kind of regional manager of that pool. A number of different structures could be used there, such as a joint venture, an RWSC sort of committee, in order to select which mitigation actions would be most effective for the species that most need it, and then can start funding those high priority mitigation actions, and then build out over time as more and more facilities come online and more money goes into that pool to then be able to fund lower or larger portfolios, for example, of actions throughout that region, and still be strategic about which of those actions would be most effective to boost the portfolio of species you're concerned about. Those are all of my thoughts for you today. Well, quick one. I want to thank my collaborators on this work and also put my contact information up there for you. If you want to follow up, it would be great to hear thoughts from everyone on this, and thank my funders. Thanks.
So next up, we'll be hearing from Aonghais Cook on behalf of Dave Wilson, who's based out of Europe. So thankfully, Aonghais could be here in person from the Biodiversity Consultancy on identifying offsite offsets, try that 6 times, for impact from collisions with onshore wind energy.
Thanks, Holly. It's great to be here, and Dave sends his apologies. So one of the sort of big challenges we face in relation to sort of compensatory mitigation relates to migrating species. So a lot of the bird species we're talking about migrate over huge distances on an annual basis. So this is an example of a paper using tracking data for large bird species migrating in Europe. And migration is a sort of fairly energetically stressful time, and pressure during that time can contribute to sort of population declines. And on top of it being an energetically stressful time, species often face multiple dispersed anthropogenic pressures which can drive these population declines. Things like habitat loss and destruction, so maybe things like loss of key stopover sites, hunting, and then collision with things like buildings, or potentially increasingly with wind energy infrastructure such as power lines and turbines. This sort of risk in relation to collision with turbines and wind energy is a sort of definitely an increasing threat for migrating species. So a lot of the areas that are really attractive to migrating birds are also really great in terms of wind energy resource. So you tend to get quite a lot of overlap between areas that are heavily used by birds on migration and areas that are heavily prioritised for wind energy development. And this sort of creates sort of potential bottlenecks where birds are sort of forced through areas with high levels of wind energy development. But this, at the same time, this also presents real challenges for things like compensatory mitigation, because the birds are only present within a country for a fairly short time period. So often we need to think about things not just at a landscape scale, but at a sort of fairly flyway scale. So what can we do elsewhere in the flyway to deliver this sort of compensatory mitigation? We need to account for the impacts associated with wind energy. So acknowledging this as an offshore wind conference, with apologies to that, I want to talk a bit about an example from Egypt in relation to onshore wind. So there's a sort of this area just on at the tip of the Red Sea, where there's a number of planned offshore wind sites that have been identified by the Egyptian government. It sort of overlaps right with one of these sort of key migratory stopover sites. And we've been working with 3 projects in this area in Egypt. A couple of sort of one sort of slightly smaller project, one slightly larger project, and another one that's still a bit confidential. These are all located on the Red Sea coast of Egypt, right along the Red Sea Rift Valley Flyway, where a large number of species and huge numbers of individuals pass through every year. And because these wind farms are close to migratory bottlenecks, there's a risk of impact to species. But importantly, these projects are funded by the international finance institutions. So this brings with it a requirement to deliver either no net loss or a no net positive impact on biodiversity from these projects. So there's a variety of species that pass through and that we think might be impacted by these projects, usually migratory soaring birds. You'll note from the slides that actually the sort of impacts mostly are relatively small, and that's important, and I'll come on to that in a second. But there's still this sort of requirement for delivering no net loss or net positive impacts. So we're focusing on 15 priority species, mostly raptors and migratory soaring birds across these sites. In some instances, the sites represent critical habitat, and where sites represent critical habitat, the requirement from the international lenders is that you deliver a net positive impact. For the other priority species, the focus is on delivering no net loss. But the real challenge is that these birds rarely land within the country, and they're often there for a matter of hours at present. So the opportunity to deliver no net no net loss or net positive is really limited. So instead of looking in country, we have to start thinking more globally and more across the flyway. So we think this is one of the first examples of where people have started to look at this sort of potential for offsets outside the country and along the flyway. And to do this, we sort of evaluated 19 potential projects across the flyway and started thinking which of these are practical to deliver. And these are projects that might be applied on the overwintering grounds or on breeding grounds, or at some point between that they might encounter during migration. But the sort of key thing is we need to sort of look across the flyway to try and identify a group of actions that are going to deliver the net positive impact or no net loss required by the international lenders for these 3 projects. And in doing this, we were able to identify three projects that we felt were likely to be effective. So there was one in-country project we identified, which was retrofitting power lines to reduce collisions to white storks and great white pelicans. And in this instance, this was a sort of a measure that we can quantify. We can look to see is this reducing the number of collisions and therefore sort of delivering the sort of impact that we're looking for by sort of saving adult birds, increasing adult survival rates. On top of this, and this is becoming a little more challenging to deliver in the past few years, but there were development of capacity for enforcement in Ukraine and Belarus. So this was focused on species like great spotted eagle, black stork, common crane. So we were able to sort of identify conservation actions within those countries. And in theory, we're able to then quantify those gains because we can go around and we can look at the nest sites and make sure that we're actually seeing an increase in nest sites and an increase in productivity. Obviously, that's got a little more challenging in the past couple of years, but in theory, this is positive. And then the third option we identified was outreach support to reduce hunting pressure in other parts of the migratory range in places like Georgia, Turkey, and Lebanon. This is something that's a bit more difficult to measure. So this is something that we don't think we can really quantify that accurately because a lot of this hunting pressure is already illegal. So sort of estimating how many additional birds we're not killing is sort of quite tricky. But because the predicted impacts associated with the projects were fairly low, the international finance institutions that were backing these measures were relatively comfortable with it. They felt like there was the potential to reduce hunting pressure sufficiently to deliver the net positive impacts that we needed for some of these species. So we identified these species, but then comes a sort of slightly tricky next step, which I think is something that Aspen was talking about a second ago. So there's once you've identified these measures, there's the sort of thorny issue of price and who pays for them and how do you deliver them. So these projects all have differing levels of impact. So it's quite tricky. Do you sort of say, well, the project that's got the greatest impact therefore has to deliver, or that has to provide the greatest level of funding? Or do you split it a bit more equally between them and say, well, actually, at a strategic level, it's better to just sort of divide the costs and deliver the impact and get your net gains that way? So I think there's a lot of difficult discussions needed about exactly once you've identified these options, how you, at a cumulative scale across projects, how you then fund and deliver them. But again, this is an offshore conference, so trying to think about offshore in a bit more detail. I think there's a lot of similarities here between what we've been trying to do in Egypt and some of the challenges that we're facing delivering compensatory mitigation offshore. So we've got these sort of challenges around cross-jurisdictional issues. So we know that a lot of the countries that maybe species might breed in the territorial waters of one country and feed in the territorial waters of another. So how do we sort of deal with that issue? We know that the species are, on the whole, are migratory, so they use a huge area of the globe, and how do we sort of identify options across that to deliver a not net positive impact? But at the same time, as Aspen sort of mentioned just now, we've got a good understanding, or we've often got a good understanding of the pressures that are facing seabirds and some of the measures that can be applied to address these threats. But at the same time, I think there's this risk that we put all their eggs in one basket. So we think we identify one measure and everyone sort of goes with that measure, and you end up over-delivering on it, and it ceases to be effective. So I think this sort of highlights the need to use a strategic approach across all of these measures. So yeah, just to quickly summarise, we've got a lot of pressures with migratory species, and it sort of creates challenges delivering a sort of no net loss or not net positive impact from projects. But I think a sort of strategic approach can really help us here, and I think this sort of the onshore example I provided sort of gives a good example of an approach that could potentially be applied offshore. Thank you.
Next up, we get to hear from Anthony Dvarskas again. So he spoke in the previous symposium on the Ørsted framework, but at this point, he's going to give us a little bit more on-the-ground intel about habitat and resource equivalency analyses as potential approaches for net positive biodiversity estimation.
Thanks, Holly. So hi, everyone, again, for some of you. And in this talk, I'm just going to talk a little bit about how the NPI framework that we have at Ørsted is aligned with a lot of what we already talk about related to HEA and REA, or habitat equivalency analysis and resource equivalency analysis. I have a broken record on this, but this is our biodiversity ambition. If you haven't heard it before, net positive, renewable energy assets post-2030. But I did want to point out that we do have a white paper here that gets at why Ørsted really thinks this biodiversity angle is important. And that is because we know that there are two crises, right? There's a climate crisis that also is related to and driving a biodiversity crisis, right? So check out that white paper that we have if you want to hear more about some of the calls to action that we have related to those dual crises. So this is the framework, and if you weren't in the last session, I went through this in a bit more detail, but I'm just going to kind of skim it lightly here because I want to talk a bit more about the habitat equivalency analysis and resource equivalency analysis. But there's 8 steps that we have from the very early stages of a project when you're just thinking about a project and getting a project off the ground, or where you might even want to do a project, doing some desktop-based analysis for early risk screening, and then identification of those priority biodiversity features. And it was great to see in many of these conversations and presentations already talking about the need to actually identify what are those priority species from a longer list of species, right? That your desktop analysis might spit out this very long list, and you need to focus that list somehow to be able to then do the future steps, which are the actual quantification steps, figuring out what monitoring you need to do, doing the monitoring on the ground, and then establishing baseline, which I'll talk a bit more about it a little bit, and then looking at what the impacts are and what kind of NPI actions we might want to do. And of course, then implementing, monitoring, and reporting out on the progress in meeting your NPI ambition or your mitigation requirement. So I just wanted to put this up here. Some of you may have seen something similar if you've had the joy of attending any conversations about habitat equivalency analysis or resource equivalency analysis. Because I wanted to point out a few of the things where some of the concepts that are in habitat equivalency analysis align with the same kinds of things that we're going to need to do our net positive impact evaluation. And just to understand what's going on here, on the y-axis we have our ecological metric, and time is on the x-axis. That wavy line there, which I might have gotten a little too wavy with, is baseline, but making the point that, as we all know, baselines are not static and flat necessarily, they're likely shifting. And And what we want to do in either a habitat equivalency analysis or a resource equivalency analysis is make sure that our area of impact is matched by our area of benefit, right? And that's area A would be the impact area. You see we have an impact that drives down whatever your ecological metric is to a lower level. Over time, that hopefully will recover to some extent back to baseline, but then you have that interim loss that's happening, which is that area A. And then when you take your intervention and NPI action, you want to raise above baseline whatever you're doing, and that's your area B. And for our typical, compensatory mitigation approaches, we're trying to make A equal to B, our no net loss, right? Area A equals area B. For MPI, what we would really be wanting to do is to make sure that B is greater than A. So these two things are related in that way, right? And they're also related in that we need to figure out what is the ecological metric that we're going to be using to evaluate NPI in the same way that in habitat equivalency analysis and resource equivalency analysis, there's a need to figure out what metric is used to evaluate that. And I meant to say before getting into this, actually, I'm focusing here on quantifiable impacts, and I thought it was good that it was just mentioned, right? There are going to be some cases, and we acknowledge this in some of the discussions we've had about our MPI framework, where we're not going to be able to quantify things, but we still want to make sure we're addressing impacts on certain species. And that's where we've at least proposed that there has to be a process for looking at a qualitative evaluation, right? Can we qualitatively say that an action that's being taken can reasonably be expected based on scientific literature to have a benefit to a species? And can there be a consensus that that's something we'd want to move forward to? So this is all very quantitative focused, but just to put out there that there is a qualitative lens that we should also use for some of those hard to quantify areas. And I think that's all I wanted to hit on there. But just to mention a bit more on the metrics determination, the metrics will need to be selected for both the impact side of things and the uplift side. And similar to the HIA and RIA approaches, ideally we'd have a metric that is consistent across both the impact and the uplift side. I think there are a few things we want to consider when we're trying to figure out what kinds of metrics to use. These won't be shocking to anyone. Relevant to the species that we're considering, also relevant to the change that is happening, either on the impact side or on the intervention side of things. The feasibility of being able to measure it. We don't want to start to propose things to be measured that we don't quite yet have the technology or certainty in being able to measure them. We really want to focus on those things we can actually get out and do some work on the ground on. Also, we want to make sure that hopefully the methods we can use to measure are not also causing harm to the environment when we're going out and measuring them. And this last item here is that ideally, because of the fact that we're trying to look at a baseline here, what we'd like to try and do, I think, is to figure out what metrics are compatible with some of the existing data sets we may have out there, right? So looking across, what are the kinds of metrics that were used to establish some of the baseline data? Rather than inventing a new metric, maybe it would make sense to use that as the thing that you're using to track your impact or your uplift level. Our NPI framework at Ørsted focuses on both species and habitats, and it talks about those separately. On the habitat side of things, I just put some examples here. You could have a much longer list of potential metrics. But on the habitat side, it uses something that's a condition and extent combo measure. This is not brand new and novel to Ørsted, right? This is out there in the ecosystem accounting standard that's been circulated by the UN and floating around there now for several years. And basically what that does is it will take a condition measure times an area, and you get a quality by area metric at the end of the day. And so those are some examples here of the things you might think about, right? Percent vegetation cover, right? That could be percent animal cover. It could be percent cover of different things, depending on what actual species you're talking about. Species richness, productivity, and then water quality and soil quality also may be relevant to track depending on what we're thinking about. And one thing I want to point out is you don't have to necessarily pick one of these measures. One of the things we're thinking will likely happen is that you'll have these measures and need to kind of consolidate them into an index that you're then reporting out on, right? So I think and that's going to be tricky and interesting to have those discussions, but I think we don't have to stick with one because it may be that multiple are useful. On the species side of things, these are just some ideas here. Again, nothing shocking. Abundance, individuals lost, individuals gained, again, which aligns with a lot of what we see in resource equivalency analysis. body condition, and fitness. And again, in habitat equivalency analysis, for those who have worked on habitat equivalency analysis, a lot of times these are the kinds of measures that will show up on the habitat equivalency analysis side of things, right, in terms of determining, there it's really talking about ecosystem service gains by an area, but it's using a proxy to get at what those ecosystem service gains might be. I promised that I would come back to the baseline issue again. And I really liked this article, if you all haven't had a chance to look at it, from Langhammer in Science this year, where they looked at conservation actions and the effectiveness of conservation actions. And it was funny, in the last session someone mentioned, well, nothing's going to have a negative impact. What was interesting in this study is they actually found some of these studies where actually the intervention ended up doing worse than what the counterfactual situation would have been, right? So I think it's something for us to keep in mind as we're doing this. Again, this is just pointing out our challenge that we want to keep in mind what that counterfactual situation or baseline would be so that we know where the intervention is in relation to that baseline. But definitely check out that paper. I thought it was really cool. Just to wrap up here, I wanted to show what a potential table might look like. And again, this is very much a work in progress. As I mentioned in the last session, we're soliciting feedback on how this all may look. This may look similar to for some of you who have worked on HIA and RIA in terms of what those kind of tables look like. But where we have a list of priority biodiversity features, here I've just picked one that would be more amenable to like a HIA, like seagrass habitat, and another that might be more RIA, like a piping plover. Looking at what the measure is that we would be tracking over time, so percent cover for seagrass habitat, number of individuals for piping plover. And then we're assuming, I'm imagining here, percent cover is the only metric we're using, and it's great, and it's fantastic for figuring out what loss we're having over time. And you can see that when we compare it to baseline, we end up with a 0.6 gain in something we're calling acre years. We could have a whole session on habitat equivalency analysis. We're not going to do that today. And then what we need to do is, if we do an offsite planting, how is that raising things above baseline? You can see that there's a projection it would be at 40%, even without action. So there's a 35% increase in baseline over those 5 acres. I don't know why there are decimal points there, but you get 1.75, which leads to a 1.15 acre years in gain. And then on the bottom here, you can see the same thing, like if we took a nest protection approach, how you might end up with a net gain for the bird species over time, even in light of a baseline that that may or may not be shifting. So that's all I wanted to hit on today. Glad to answer any questions, and here's the link for the measurement framework to check out. Thanks very much.
Great. Now, next we have Kate Searle, who's joining us. She's on a Zoom currently, but we're going to listen to her pre-recorded talk about research to underpin policies designed to offset impacts from offshore wind and achieve net gain in the UK.
Kate Searle from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, based in Edinburgh in the UK. Many apologies for not being able to come in person today, but thank you very much for coming to my talk, where I will be talking about a large consortium research project aiming to provide the research needed to underpin policies designed to offset impacts from offshore wind and achieve net gain in the UK. In the UK, we're undergoing a transition from project-based to strategic delivery of compensation and marine net gain in the UK. And we have a legal framework in place that means that if a development like an offshore wind farm is deemed to have a potential adverse effect on protected species, such as a seabird, then they're required to undertake an appropriate assessment at a project level and in combination, so that means with other relevant developments in the local area, and they may be required to deliver compensation to offset the predicted negative impact or loss. And in addition, the UK is now moving towards not only offsetting against potential losses, but also to delivering marine net gain. So essentially requiring that developments leave the environment in a better state than before. However, the existing legislative framework has resulted in a very strong focus on population or SPA, special protected area level assessments of impact mitigation and compensation. The scale and pace of offshore wind development in UK waters means that we're now faced with transitioning from a very project and population-focused approach to a more cumulative and regional approach. So when we think about delivering no net loss or positive gains at much larger scales, such as the North Sea, we're confronted with a much larger scale of cumulative impact, requiring potentially sizable compensation measures and significant levels of net gain. So we must now ask whether we can in fact compensate for the potential scale of loss at the North Sea scale. And as researchers, what science do we need to deliver to strategically secure compensation and deliver marine net gain at these scales? We're part of a research consortium aiming to deliver evidence to support strategic implementation of compensatory measures for seabirds and the wider ecosystem in the UK. Our project is called EcoWings, and it's part of the Natural Environment Research Council EcoWind programme, and our study area is in the North Sea. And we're focusing on 3 research questions. Firstly, what are the cumulative impacts of offshore wind farms on seabirds and the wider ecosystem in the North Sea, so the losses? Secondly, what strategic compensatory measures to deliver net gain to seabirds and the ecosystem are needed, so the gains? And thirdly, how do we incorporate sufficient headroom for climate change to ensure positive marine net gain outcomes into the future? And in this talk, I'll provide a summary of our work under these 3 themes, and then conclude with some additional thoughts on key aspects for delivering a strategic framework for compensation and net gain in the UK context. So for cumulative impact assessments to scale up to large regional scales like the North Sea, in our project we're developing new rapid cumulative impact assessment tools where we estimate cumulative impacts of multiple offshore wind farms on seabirds by estimating where seabirds obtain their food at sea, shown here on the left, and we then are able to overlay scenarios of offshore wind development footprints and estimate the demographic consequences through a simple energetic model of any potential loss of prey as a result of displacement from these wind farms, and integrate these methods into a new rapid CIA tool for regional scale assessments. And to support the development of these tools, we're also collecting new data, shown here on the right-hand side of the slide. So there's a striking lack of existing simultaneous high-resolution data on fish and seabird distributions. And these data are really important because we expect that the effects of offshore wind farms and seabirds are actually likely to operate functionally at very small spatial scales. So a key question is whether birds are directly disturbed and displaced from wind farms, or alternatively whether fish are displaced and redistributed, and birds are responding to these changes in their prey, or some combination of the two. And we're conducting a series of surveys using uncrewed surface vessels and autonomous underwater vessels to estimate prey density right through the water column and to relate these to bird surveys from aeroplanes and other sources that are being conducted in the region at the same time, which are funded by local wind farm developers. And we can then estimate the effects of offshore wind on seabirds at the prey patch scale and introduce this new mechanistic process-based understanding into our CIA tool to help reduce uncertainty in estimates of impacts or losses at these large regional scales. So one of the very significant challenges with delivering compensatory measures for seabirds is the lack of empirical evidence on their effectiveness. And in situations such as this, expert opinion can be gathered through a formal process called expert elicitation. And this is where experts provide estimates of effects with associated uncertainty, and this means that disparate views are captured and incorporated. So we conducted an expert elicitation to identify a suite of compensatory measures for seabirds, and we asked experts to rank them on their potential effectiveness for each seabird species, and then to estimate changes in seabird survival and productivity for the top ranked measures. So each expert provided a mean and lower and upper limits on their estimates, and these were translated into statistical distributions shown in the graph here for 5 experts. So we can then use these estimates of changes in demographic rates from the expert elicitation and also from empirical evidence where available within seabird population models to look at the large-scale capacity for compensating seabirds for predicted impacts of offshore wind via these available compensatory measures, and critically to understand whether these measures are in fact capable of achieving net gain at the scale of the whole North Sea. So we're also recognizing that we need to focus more on the whole ecosystem, not just individual taxa. So we're using an ecosystem model of the North Sea called STRAT-E2E, which simulates end-to-end food web dynamics, including all components of the North Sea ecosystem. It's driven by physical and chemical oceanographic inputs and also commercial fishing effort. And we're running scenarios to assess how North Sea scale offshore wind impacts on seabirds and commercial fisheries permeate through all of the ecosystem elements. And this is shown in an illustrative example here. So on the left line, we have the predicted ecosystem effects of a 5% mortality of seabirds across the North Sea. And on the right, we have the ecosystem responses to a reduction in sand eel trawling required to restore seabirds back to their baseline level. So this could be a compensatory measure. And you can see additional benefits to planktivorous fish, pinnipeds and cetaceans when this is done, but also additional losses for some lower trophic levels such as zooplankton. So the model can also investigate effects right across the food web, and this helps to identify any unintended consequences arising from trophic interactions and from different compensatory measures that we might try to use. And we're also including predicted positive gains from compensatory measures for seabirds in the model, and have found that measures that affect seabird food indirectly, for example by habitat restoration or creation for prey species, are those that are most likely to be effective in increasing seabird biomass in the North Sea. We're also considering how we can incorporate sufficient climate headroom so that interventions to deliver net gain are resilient to the shifting baseline in the North Sea ecosystem. And we're tackling this question through a series of linked models on physics and biogeochemistry, on zooplankton abundance, and on sand eel and sprat energy budget models. And we're using these outputs to understand how these shifts might shape changes in seabird populations in coming decades, as well as affecting the wider North Sea ecosystem, again, using the model STRAT-E2E. And this will provide underpinning evidence for the shifting baseline in seabird populations and across the ecosystem against which potential net gain may be measured. And it can also help inform how multiple compensatory measures can be combined together to deliver strategic compensation to offset impacts at large scales, and what impacts these measures will have on other sectors, in particular commercial fisheries. Just some thoughts on how we might deliver compensation and marine net gain in the UK at these large scales. So it's increasingly clear that both compensatory measures and actions to achieve marine net gain will need to involve interventions across the whole ecosystem, not just targeting single species, to deliver offsets and gains at the scale required in the North Sea. So how should a framework accommodate this ecosystem scale of delivery? So a key component will be the strength of scientific evidence that is needed for the expected outcome or the gains. For example, an increase in carrying capacity of seabirds, but via interventions that are aimed at lower trophic levels such as habitats or their prey. And we need to consider how we monitor changes in these trophic levels, and critically for legislation over what timescales these gains can be demonstrated. And a key aspect to this will be ensuring strategic oversight of losses and gains across the whole ecosystem so that the integrity of individual protected species such as seabirds is maintained, but that we don't underdeliver because legislative requirements are too restrictive and potentially disincentivize interventions that have high potential for gains, but that are risky or difficult to monitor to determine effectiveness. Very much for listening, and I'll be very happy to take any questions. Thanks.
like to invite the speakers, please, to come up to have a seat, and also
yeah, so we can see you now, Kate.
as far as let's go. Sorry.
This is how far it goes.
Further. Okay, we're going to do this a little differently. We're going to have three of us alternating on asking questions. We'll field some audience and then also take a little bit from our own. So I'm going to start here. We had a question about advanced mitigation. It's probably going to go towards Scott to begin. The definition of advanced mitigation, you can correct me, please, but as I understand it, it has to do with showing demonstrated success of projects. And the question that I'd like to pose is, how do we show demonstrated success of mitigation projects when we're completely new to this in the offshore realm?
Well, this is a great way to start off the questions, because I don't know anything about advanced mitigation other than I have seen it recently and have talked to a few people about how it's been done, but I don't, unfortunately, I don't have anything to contribute it to the question right now. I'm sorry. I don't know if anybody else does. Stephanie, do you? You do? Okay. Maybe you can.
I think Stephanie should come up here.
Well, yeah, but I think it was right. I think I said that, but yeah, but I think how to do it and how to evaluate and get credit for that in advance of the, is a whole different question. Yeah, sorry.
Do you want to try and address that, Angus?
So, I mean, I guess one approach, or an approach in Europe is generally that the mitigation needs to be established before the project proceeds. So you'd be wanting to have put the mitigation in place and seen that it's starting to deliver the results that you expect it to before sort of project development happens.
Anyone else?
No, I would just say, and I used to work with NOAA on natural resource damage assessment, and I know there were some discussions there about early restoration. I'm not sure where those are now, but I think that probably would be relatively similar to what we're talking about here. But I think, as I recall, some of the challenges are figuring out exactly how you take account for the changes that might occur once, post having committed to that amount of restoration, and so much ahead of when the impacts might actually be being evaluated, right? And I think that's probably remains a challenge.
Okay, Scott, there's a lot of interest in this one. How is the recent Supreme Court Chevron decision going to impact Fish and Wildlife's ability to either further refine the mitigation policy, so looking at things like advanced mitigation and setting your standards, et cetera?
I'm trying not to take this personally, but do you guys not like me or something? No, it's a great question. And no, there's been, other than trying to figure that out, but we haven't had those conversations, at least in my office, we have not. But definitely, I think it will have some effect. That's probably an understatement, but so I'll leave it at that. Sorry. I'm 0 for 2, I think.
I'm gonna kind of combine a couple of questions, I think, together. And this is I think we can probably direct this question to everyone. The question is, where do potentially high value beneficial projects that are difficult to quantify and put into metrics fit into required offsetting mitigation and voluntary net positive impact type framework? And I think that this was also mentioned, Kate actually, I think, mentioned this in her slides sort of towards the end, that was a recommendation that this might be an issue where important projects might not be taken on because they can't be measured. So I'm curious to know what people think about where that might fit in.
Well, I can take a stab at that one. So in the policy right now with the Fish and Wildlife Service for compensatory mitigation research, except in fairly rare circumstances, is not allowed. But honestly, and I think Anthony talked about this, when it comes to red knot mitigation, I think that's going to be a very, very difficult species to really quantify metrics in either reducing or increasing productivity or reducing mortality. We may have a few opportunities, maybe managing hunting, some red tide mitigation perhaps in the Gulf. But when it comes to habitat restoration, say in Delaware Bay, and measuring the exact number of red knots that have been produced because of increased egg availability, I think will be very difficult. But as Anthony said, I think we in studies have shown that increasing egg availability, et cetera, can increase weights, which is critical for productivity on the breeding grounds. So, I think that we need to kind of push that envelope a little bit, at least for that species. For something like a piping plover, I think maybe that's going to be a little bit easier to work on breeding grounds. Do predator control, for example, is at least increasing available habitat. I mean, those are, I don't want to say they're easier projects, but my mind spins a little bit when it comes to red knot for sure. So I definitely think that we need to kind of push that envelope a little bit.
And just from the voluntary ambition side of things, I think, and I mentioned it earlier, I think this is something that's definitely part of what we're thinking about is these non-quantifiable, and also because some of the priority species we're thinking about, it's very hard to think of what are the restoration measures that are exactly the same and will produce the same metric, right? If we think of marine mammal impacts, for example, right? I think it's going to be something else that we're doing that reduces pressures on marine mammals rather than trying to grow more prey for marine mammals or put them in the right place or something like that, right? So I think that it's definitely part of it. I think the challenge is we'll want to really make sure that scientific base that we're using, even if it's not quantifiable, is solid enough so that people feel like what's being done is valid. And I think that's where we'll have to do our homework.
I mean, I think to some extent it depends on the level of impact. So maybe if you've got a smaller impact, you might be a bit more comfortable with a measure that maybe it's a bit harder to quantify, but you think it's likely to be effective and have some impact. But whereas if you've got a larger impact that you're trying to compensate for, you might want to be able to quantify that more exactly. But again, and then a lot of it's going to come down to monitoring as well.
I'm going to direct this next question to, I think, probably Aspen and Kate. Just seeing a lot of what Kate was presenting on in terms of ecosystem effects and sort of looking at fisheries compensatory models. How direct of a relationship do we need between producing the metrics of growing and saving birds to ensure project success?
Thanks. I can answer not with the UK perspective specifically, but I think that agnostic to existing policy around listed species, potentially moving into the non-listed species space, there's a little bit more flexibility in that, which can be a really good and powerful thing, I think. Especially when you're starting to manage at the regional scale for portfolios of species. I think that gives you a little bit more capacity to be creative about the projects that you are funding. I do think that, of course, we won't be able realistically to fund projects that mitigate every single impact to every species, and therefore you have to be more strategic and, I think, collaborative in planning out which those actions are. So I think that there will be some very high priority species for which there are not clear mitigation actions, and in those cases it may have to be a less direct link in terms of being more creative about actions that may be able to produce boosts to those species. But I'd be excited to hear Kate's thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me okay? Sorry, I've got a bit of an echo, but I'll just speak. Yeah, so I think what's becoming clear in the UK with the scale of impacts that we're needing to produce, that we are, as Aspen was just saying, we're very much sort of starting to look. Can you hear me okay? You look a little
Yes.
We're good. Sorry. Yeah, so we definitely are looking to sort of move beyond interventions that are sort of very direct in terms of the impact they have on species. So things like building nesting towers for kittiwakes and predator removal, those are going to be very effective, and there's a lot of good scientific evidence to support the implementation and the efficacy of those approaches. But inevitably, there's a limit to the sort of capacity of how many islands there are in the UK that we can sort of remove rats from, for instance. So we are sort of needing to move beyond and look at approaches that perhaps are more to do with prey availability for breeding seabirds, for instance. And in that case, it will be very difficult to demonstrate and monitor those impacts. And so I think what people are talking about in the UK is very much, and actually I think Anthony mentioned this earlier as well, it's this idea of sort of needing almost a hierarchy or a suite of approaches to monitoring and demonstrating impact. And you need to make sure that that suite of monitoring covers sort of various metrics that tell you things, hopefully relatively quickly, about the effectiveness of that measure, recognizing that ultimately with long-lived species like seabirds, it may in fact take, possibly a decade to actually demonstrate the sort of change in survivorship, for instance, in a population. So it's about sort of designing your monitoring in an appropriate way to recognize, I guess, sort of how some of these interventions are going to need to propagate up through trophic levels, and the fact that that's going to take time and it's going to be difficult to demonstrate those immediately. So it's about having a framework that I think hopefully allows you to have a set of measures, that maybe look at changes that are occurring in those different trophic levels and look at trends, and hopefully sort of recognize that for some of these more difficult implementations, that's sufficient to demonstrate a positive impact, rather than sort of having to say, yes, I have made 102 more kittiwakes, for instance.
Anyone else?
Maybe one more. Probably one more. So Angus, can you speak a little more to the process by which some of the projects were chosen for, say, soaring birds and raptors? And then do you think it's a process that's generalizable to, say, other regions or other species groups?
So, generally, I think the idea of compensatory mitigation is that it should apply as closely to the site as possible, and also you want things to be that are quantifiable. So it was sort of fairly high-level screening process and looking at the potential measures and thinking, well, how close are these to the site? Can we quantify the impacts? So with things like the sort of power line diverters and things like that, we know that they're on the site and that we can quantify the impacts. With some of the conservation measures in places like Ukraine or Belarus, we know we can quantify the measures. We know that they're sort of not, as far as the flyway goes, they're not too far from the site. So we're sort of fairly happy that we can deliver stuff there and make sure it's quantifiable. The sort of slightly grey area was around the sort of hunting pressures in Georgia and Turkey and places like that. But again, we know that the birds that are on that flyway that are passing through places like Turkey, Lebanon, Georgia are likely to also be passing the same birds that are passing through the Red Sea flyway. So we're sort of fairly happy that even if we can't quantify the impact, there's going to be an impact, a sort of positive impact, because we're reducing hunting pressure, and it's going to be on the species we're interested in. I think that type of approach, thinking about how quantifiable things are and how close they are to the sites of the impact, probably is sort of fairly generalizable.
We're at noon. Anybody else want to comment on that? Okay. Well, let's give a round of applause to our panel. Thank you so much. And some of you can stay up here. And then I'd like to invite Trish